Greetings, this is Mike Billington. I'm co-editor at the Executive Intelligence Review. I'm here today with Joel Dejean for an interview for the EIR and for the Schiller Institute and for the Larouche organization. Joel Dejean is a Larouche independent candidate for Congress in the 38th District of Texas, running against a Republican favorite, Wesley Hunt. Joel was born in Haiti. He moved with his parents at the age of 6 to the Bronx in New York, earning admission to the prestigious Bronx High School of Science, and then earned an electrical engineering degree from the State University of New York in Stony Brook, followed by 8 years working at the Texas Instruments Defense Electronic Group, working on projects for the U.S., Australian, and South Korean Air Forces. He has been a collaborator of Lyndon Larouche's Fusion Energy Foundation and the Larouche political movement since 1985. In 1995, while Joel was campaigning for a Larouche associate in France, he suffered a severe retinal tear in his right eye. And upon returning to Houston and efforts to save that eye and work on the other eye, it failed and he ended up blind. But this has in no way stopped his full-time effort to fight for the future of mankind. He's able to read anything he wishes on the internet through various apps, and also has access to audio books and to 500 newspapers and magazines from the National Federation of the Blind. And in fact, his campaign slogan is that he's the only candidate with a positive vision for the future. Welcome, Joel.
Thank you.
Would you like to add anything about your career?
Well, the only thing I'll add is in July of 1969, I was 10 years old, and I remember being on a family vacation to the Niagara Falls area. And in the evening of July 20th, I remember watching Neil Armstrong come down the lunar lander and take that giant leap for mankind. And that inspired me to study real science and eventually becoming an engineer, and that's how I ended up in Texas.
Okay, so you've run for office before in Texas. You ran for the Houston Independent School Board in the fall of 1993, and then for the U.S. Congress in the 25th Congressional District in Texas in 1994, campaigning for Larouche's solutions to the unfolding economic and strategic breakdown. What made you decide to run again at this critical moment in global history?
Well, back then we were running as Larouche Democrats. Larouche himself in January of '94 was still in prison. He was paroled just a few weeks later. And we were trying to revive the tradition of the Democratic Party, the Roosevelt-Kennedy tradition of scientific optimism and a control of the banking system. Now in 2022, both parties have completely lost any tradition to the American system. And the idea of running as an independent is, as Larouche said on his 90th birthday, party politics is out. Party politics is corrupt. So we have to give an alternative to the American people, because if you look at the policies coming from the Republicans and the Democrats, they are in goose step marching towards war, depression, and famine. So we have to give the American public in Texas, the nation, and the world an alternative.
So both you and Diane Sayer, who's also a Larouche independent candidate running for Senate against Chuck Schumer in New York, are actually running as national candidates to build a movement of citizens to take responsibility for the current global crisis of civilization. the impending dark age of economic and strategic collapse, which at this point no one can avoid. What inspired you to join the LaRouche movement in the first place?
Well, the first time I ran into LaRouche was in March 23rd, 1983. I didn't even know LaRouche then, but I had just completed a round of flight tests with an upgraded infrared detection system at the air base in the Panhandle of Florida, Eglin Air Base. And I got wind that Reagan was going to give a national defense speech that evening. So I watched Reagan go through and say that we have to get the scientific community that gave us nuclear weapons to give us the capability to make them impotent and obsolete. Although I wasn't working on strategic weapons, I was working on tactical weapons, but that speech spoke to me directly. I was inspired by that speech. And the next day I went in and there was almost no reaction. So it took another 2 years before I ran into LaRouche organizers while I was on a trip in LA. And then I started reading LaRouche's material. I joined the Fusion Energy Foundation. And that's when I got a clear conception of what Reagan had been talking about. He wasn't talking about off-the-shelf technology. He was talking about new physical principles, although he didn't put it in those terms. So once I met the organization, that inspired me to learn more and more, and that's how I came to know LaRouche.
Your district, your district was recently created, as I understand it, by gerrymandering by a state government, which is Republican-led at this point in Texas, and it includes much of the world-famous Houston energy corridor. The gerrymandering was designed for your opponent, actually, Captain Wesley Hunt, who is a West Point graduate and a helicopter pilot in the Iraq War, who is supported and funded by Donald Trump, Mike Pompeo, James Baker, and others from the military-industrial complex. What is Hunt's program, and what is the choice you are presenting to the voting public in contrast to that of Captain Hunt?
Here's the irony. Hunt claims to be against the Green New Deal, but on his website, he says that he's for decarbonizing the economy. He's for a shift away from fossil fuels. His version, though, is he wants to wait till Russia, India, and China get rid of fossil fuels first. So he wants them to commit suicide and then we can join them. So Hunt's policy is the same as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the same as James Baker. It's for the Green New Deal, if not in name, but in actuality. And his other policy is to confront Russia, crush their economy, and his policies are leading us directly towards World War III with Russia and China.
You're well known as an expert on the science of nuclear and fusion energy. You've given classes and you write articles on the necessary transformation of the way we live through the development of fusion power, as opposed to the Green New Deal, and fusion power which could provide essentially unlimited energy for all of mankind. What is your message regarding fusion, and why has its development been sabotaged over these past 60 years since Kennedy called for a crash program before he was assassinated?
Well, I was always for nuclear power, mostly nuclear fission power. As a matter of fact, when I was in the 5th grade, I made a model of a nuclear reactor. And the only thing I couldn't get is yellow cake, so it never went critical. But I was always for nuclear power. As a matter of fact, my last year at Stony Brook, the IEEE caucus in the university visited Shoreham nuclear power plant. It was scheduled to come online within a few months. And Mario Cuomo, at that time governor of New York, shut down that plant. And after $5 billion spent on building it, not 1 watt of power was produced. So as I ran into the Fusion Energy Foundation, I saw that not only was Larouche in favor of fission nuclear power, he was in favor of a full-fledged development of fusion power, not just for energy, but for things like space propulsion, a way of getting to Mars and other destinations at a high enough speed so that the occupants of the spacecraft will have a chance to arrive at their destination ready for exploration.
So you're already well known in Houston. You've spoken several times in the recent past to the Houston City Council as a strong opponent of the Green New Deal, both because of the faulty science behind the carbon argument, and but also because it's used to justify the banking cartel's diversion of credit from industry and agriculture and scientific research in order to bail out the bankrupt transatlantic financial system. How are people responding to your message?
Well, last year on February 9th, I testified to the Houston City Council and the mayor, Sylvester Turner, 1 week before the deep freeze hit Texas. And we both warned them, me and Joe Jennings, who testified also, we warned the city council and the mayor that their adoption of the Green New Deal and the climate action plan would not only threaten Houston as energy capital, it would lead to brownouts and blackouts. And 1 week later, the whole state froze over, which obviously was blamed on global warming. And we had a blackout for 48 to 96 hours, depending on your neighborhood, and close to 1,000 Texans died freezing in the dark. So people I mentioned that to realize that not only was I right, but that this whole sham of global warming is a fraud. However, people like Sylvester Turner went on national television 1 week later and said that the freeze proves that global climate change is real. So they're too dense to get it, but the population has reacted quite positively to what I said.
And I think you spoke recently to the city council, right?
Yes, yesterday went up to, there's a little town in the district called Bunker Hill. And I went up there and I had 3 minutes to speak. So I began by referencing the other Bunker Hill, the one near Boston, and referenced that 247 years ago, yesterday, the Battle of Lexington and Concord occurred, which eventually led in June of that year to the Battle of Bunker Hill. And while we eventually lost that battle to the British, that battle proved that the Continental Army was a formidable force and eventually forced the British out of Boston. And then I referenced that there was a British officer who said after the battle that any more victories like this and we'll lose the war, which they eventually did lose. But then I referenced that now the British control Capitol Hill, from the president who's called for regime change in Russia, to the senators like Senator Coons from Delaware, who's called for American boots on the ground in Ukraine, to lunatics like Senator Wicker from Mississippi, who's called for dropping nuclear bombs on Russia. So you have this whole Capitol Hill operation, the Congress, the Democrats and the Republicans, are, like I said, in lockstep, in goose step, marching towards World War III, totally oblivious to the control that the British retain over Capitol Hill in our government.
So you wrote in a campaign statement on March 22nd, which I read, that we are now facing, quote, the front end of the final hyperinflationary collapse of the Western dollar-based liberal free market edifice of Western finance, forecast decades ago by economist Lyndon Larouche. End quote. You note that the unsustainable bubble of several quadrillion dollars in gambling debts that can never be repaid is driving a policy of fascist austerity and outright starvation globally. So what is the solution?
Well, the solution is quite simple. Larouche laid it out back in June of 2014 in his 4 laws to save the economy. First step is we have to reintroduce Franklin Roosevelt's Glass-Steagall Act, where we separate the commercial banks of the investment banks. We have to control the issuance of currency. We have to nationalize the Federal Reserve so that we can issue long-term, low-interest credit to infrastructure, things like high-speed rail, water management. And the 4th law is that we have to have a full-scale crash program to get controlled thermonuclear fusion, hopefully in the next decade. Combine that, we're working with Russia, China, India, and the United States, the 4 powers. We could overwhelm this London, Wall Street dying financial system, and we can get the world on a firm security and economic development architecture.
You have also spoken out against the extreme evil being done to Afghanistan through the sanctions after 20 years of destruction, imposing sanctions, even stealing their reserves that were deposited in U.S. and European banks. Afghanistan, as well as your birthplace, Haiti, represent 2 of the most serious threats of outright genocide, now facing the conscience of mankind. How have you acted on this, and what do you propose?
Well, first, back in October, held a rally outside the Houston office of the Federal Reserve, demanding that the $9 billion in funds, Afghan funds, being held by the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury be released. It was bad enough that the U.S. stole $9 billion in Afghan national money after spending $2 trillion in destroying that nation over the last 20 years. But I have endorsed the Schiller Institute's plan for development of Afghanistan, and we issued a plan in October for the development of Haiti, which was proposed by China 5 years ago, where they would fund and develop water, sanitation, and power for the city of Port-au-Prince. And Haiti, which is not a sovereign country, was told by the IMF and the US State Department that you have no right to work with China. So after the earthquake of 2010 and after the earthquake last year, August, nothing has been rebuilt except for a few fancy hotels for the non-governmental organizations that come in like vultures to feast off the carcass of Haitians. So I support the Schiller Institute's plan to develop Haiti, and I actually called for Haiti to be the first nation to go from charcoal power, because charcoal provides 75% of the power used in Haiti. And I called for Haiti to go from charcoal power to fusion power in the next 10 years, obviously with the help of the U.S. and China. So that's the way out for Haiti. That's the way out for Afghanistan. And now that they got away with stealing $9 billion from Afghan funds, the same Treasury Department and Federal Reserve System has stolen $300 billion from Russia. So these guys are the biggest bank robbers in history.
Indeed. The world famous MD Anderson Medical Center in Houston was one of the first targets of FBI Chief Christopher Wray, both during the Trump administration and continuing in the Biden administration, carrying out an outright McCarthyite war on Chinese and Chinese American scientists in the United States, called the China Initiative, threatening them with arrest, many of whom were arrested, many of whom were thrown out of their jobs on the false claim that they were, because of their collaboration with Chinese scientists, were somehow functioning as spies. This China Initiative has recently been shut down under enormous pressure from Americans, not just Chinese Americans, but Americans who recognized this was an abomination to be taking place in the United States. But the witch hunt against all things Chinese is continuing. So you, I know, have spoken out against this. What have you done to counter this anti-China hysteria?
Well, just to add, you may remember that last few months of the Trump administration, they actually shut down the Houston Chinese consulate. And over the last 5 years, we've actually had a series of meetings with representatives from the Houston Chinese consulate talking about the Belt and Road Initiative. We had one meeting where the Chinese council, a representative, and a representative from the Pakistan council here met with the Schiller Institute at a university campus to discuss the Belt and Road Initiative. So I have continued to call for the Belt and Road Initiative, and I am also calling for the U.S. to join that in what was called the North American Belt and Road Initiative. We should be part of this massive infrastructure building. And if you look at what the FBI has done, the FBI has shut down all of the consulate activities in Houston. They have gone after Chinese scientists, like you said. And they say that the fact that Chinese scientists are working on a cure for cancer is somehow a national security threat. So I continued to denounce that, and we went to the Chinese New Year's festival this past February and got out a statement I put out on working with China. We don't need to be enemies with China and Russia. We need to collaborate on the frontiers of science, space, fusion, and medical science.
Now, of course, the focus has shifted to an all-out demonization and attack on Russia. A total degeneration of international relations with Russia from the West, and the massive and illegal economic warfare against Russia, openly aimed at destroying the Russian economy. Supposedly, this is justified by Russia's military operations against Ukraine. But as we now all know, the U.S. killed millions of innocents and drove millions more out of their homes in totally illegal wars against Serbia, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and more, and never faced justice for these crimes. Helga Larouche and the Schiller Institute have called for an international conference of all nations to establish a new security and development architecture for all nations, based on the 1648 Peace of Westphalia, which settled 150 years of warfare in Europe by establishing sovereign nation states who recognized their interest to be the interest of the other and forgave all previous alleged crimes on both sides in order to establish peace through development. So I know you're working on this. How are you organizing for this event to have this international conference and to prevent this extreme danger of a war with Russia, which also, of course, could be nuclear, and will almost certainly include a similar war against China?
There are a significant number of Muslims in the district. I don't know the exact percentage, but my campaign has gone to several of the mosques in the district or right near the district. And we have spoken to the people after coming out of the service, and we mentioned the obvious hypocrisy of the U.S. being so concerned about the poor Ukrainians and not giving a damn about the millions of people killed in the illegal war in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. So the reaction has been quite positive. There are a large number of Pakistanis, and we were speaking to them about how Imran Khan was being targeted for daring to speak his mind and saying that Pakistan is not a slave of the West. And you saw what happened last week where he was overthrown. So I'm continuing to organize with the Muslims in the district, and I'm scheduling an event for next week where we will bring together contacts that we've met on the college campuses. There are 4 community college campuses in the district where we have gotten literally tens of probably over 100 student contacts of all ages. There are a lot of veterans who are going to these community colleges, veterans of the Iraq War, veterans of the Afghan War, who are trying to make something out of their lives, realize that their efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan were totally wasted, not by their service, but by people like my Republican opponent, Wesley Hunt, who, like you said, is a graduate of West Point and is campaigning proud of the fact that he ran 55 combat missions flying Apache attack helicopters in Iraq. And as a reward for his service, he became a diplomatic liaison to Saudi Arabia, the very nation that financed and supplied the hijackers that took down the World Trade Center and attacked the Pentagon. So I've issued a call demanding, challenging Wesley Hunt to fess up and confess to what was he doing in Saudi Arabia. And is he still proud of his disgraceful service in Iraq? And so far I've gotten no response. But I continue to organize on the campuses, at the mosques, and all over the district, city councils, wherever we can find people. And like I said, I'm holding this event next week to bring these forces together.
I should also mention and ask about the situation in Ukraine, where our media, our Congress, the Biden administration, both parties are all talking about saving the heroic Ukrainians and denying the self-evident and extensively proven fact that the cutting edge of the Ukrainian battle and war against the people of the Donbass since the coup in 2014, in which the U.S., Victoria Nuland, and Joe Biden openly supported neo-Nazi forces with swastikas, supporters of Stepan Bandera, Hitler's ally in Ukraine. and that we are now proudly supporting what can only be described as a neo-Nazi force carrying out mass murder in Ukraine and trying to blame everything that happens on the Russians. I'm sure you have been speaking out against this, and I wonder if you want to comment on it.
Yes, I've gone to several conservative Republican meetings and brought this up, that Wesley Hunt and his backers like James Baker III are pushing policies that are leading us directly towards war with Russia. Not so much over Ukraine, but I've spoken out to say that it was the last 30 years of NATO expansion, where after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall coming down, you have NATO. After James Baker III promised the Soviet government, Gorbachev personally, that the West, NATO would not move 1 inch to the east if Gorbachev allowed the reunification of East and West Germany under NATO. And well, he was truthful. They didn't move 1 inch to the east. They moved 1,000 kilometers to the east. And anytime I mention that this fight around Ukraine is leading towards war, I've had no one say, yeah, we should attack Russia. We should go in for the kill. Lunatic policies that are coming out of the Senate right now. So there is a reaction against this propaganda. But if people have no alternative to what the real history of the coup in 2014 in Ukraine is, and the policy of regime change that worked so successfully in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, in our attempt at regime change in Syria, people realize that we've been going down the wrong road, and to back either a Republican or Biden Democrat is suicide.
The sanctions policies of the U.S. against many nations, but now emphatically against Russia and China, and their theft of foreign nations' reserves, which you mentioned, is now driving the majority of the world's nations to move away from dealing with the dollar at all, since that's used as the justification for stealing their reserves and imposing sanctions. They're now beginning to trade in local currencies, and Russia and China and others are even setting up a totally alternative financial structure, independent of the dollar. So if the world devolves even further into these warring blocs, a war and global chaos will certainly become unavoidable. How can we bring Americans and Europeans to understand that their future depends on cooperation with all nations rather than the dying delusion of a unitary superpower controlling the world from Washington and Wall Street?
Well, the spear point of changing the United States is Diane Scare's campaign for Senate, which she began the petitioning in New York State yesterday. And my campaign out here against these Republican lunatics like Wesley Hunt. And we have to mobilize people in the oil industry, scientists, people in NASA, ordinary Americans to realize that their self-interest is in working with Russia, working with China to develop the world, or lacking that, we're going to march right down to World War III, where no one will come out winning that war.
Okay, well, thanks. Would you like to add anything?
Yes, today, we're taping this on April the 20th, is the 50th anniversary of Apollo 16 landing on the moon. So we went to the moon not just to beat the Russians. We landed 6 lunar landers on the moon over a 3.5 year period. and the astronauts of Apollo 16, Duke and John Young, collected 200 pounds of lunar samples, which they brought back to Earth. Now, it turns out that in those lunar samples, unknown at the time they were collected, is a rare isotope of helium, helium-3, which is very rare on Earth, but there are an estimated 1 million tons of helium-3 on the lunar surface, which we could have access to. And helium-3 happens to be the perfect fuel for fusion, second generation fusion reactors, using deuterium from seawater and helium-3 from the moon. And a Chinese scientist had estimated that if we were to develop the helium-3 on the moon, we would have enough power, fusion power, to take care of the needs on Earth for tens of thousands of years. And there's plenty of helium-3 in the large gaseous planets like Saturn, Neptune, so we would never run out. So the Chinese are aware of this. That's why they're pushing for a lunar program. And as Larouche said it in 1987 for his 88 campaign for president, we have to develop fusion propulsion so we can get to Mars in a matter of days instead of months. We can't keep using chemical rockets like we've been using for the last 60 years if we hope to develop Mars. And that is the future that I'm laying out to my constituents and the constituents in Texas, is that we could use the tradition of Apollo, use the tradition of American science, which developed nuclear power, and use that to not only develop the moon and develop Mars, but give children of today something to look forward to. Right now, all they have to look forward to is starvation and war. We have to give them a future.
Well, thank you, Joel. Joel Dejean, candidate in Texas for Congress. I think this extremely optimistic message, so desperately needed in a nation fearful and demoralized by the degeneration of our economy and the danger of global war. Such a message should ring true and inspire both young and old in your district and around the country. And we will make sure this interview gets spread far and wide. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.